Today, we're talking about game mastering, specifically setting your players up for success. And if you're curious, I'm Jeff. This is In the Box podcast talking about, setting others up for success. And that applies to other areas of people's lives as well. But in this case, we're referring to game masters. And I've learned some difficult, nigh on to painful lessons over the years about this topic. I want to share what I mean by all this today in hopes that I will save some other poor GM out there from a similar fate. Because failure to plan ahead a little bit can be the death knell of a long running campaign. It could even signal the end of a friendship while the group is breaking up. You don't always have to go to Reddit for interpersonal drama, hellhole site that it is. Sometimes it comes to you, the GM, in the form of your regular gaming crew. So, GMs, please don't be the one driving the plot wagon. Those poor players, some of them never saw it coming. Others did, but perhaps not in time. The plot wagon rolled into town right over the top of everyone. There were no survivors. Let me explain. A lot of times we teach new GMs or dungeon masters how to run and set up adventures in a very linear fashion. So the adventure goes from A to B to C to D to E and done. And here's your loot, if any, or experience or whatever. And the climax of the story usually pops in right around C or D. There are variations of this formula, but that's the easiest and most obvious thing to teach most people because it looks like the structure of most books and TV shows that we're used to. The problem comes when some DMs or GMs never move beyond it. Unfortunately, a lot of commercially written fantasy adventures are still written this way. It's like the GM has a novel in his head and he wants to write it. They just need players to fill the dialogue between the scenes. Then, just when the players think they have an original solution, the plot wagon pulls up and runs them over. Basically, the GM decides that the player's wackadoodle plan isn't actually in the module anywhere, so they're just going to go ahead with what was written in the module and the book, pretty much regardless of what the player said. Unfortunately, this whole process is called railroading, and it leaves a lot of experienced players feeling like maybe their choices don't matter at the time when they should totally 100% matter. The game, at the end of the day, is all about the players. And I get it. Sometimes it's hard to step back as a GM and just let it run. And as a friend of mine used to say, if you're managing well, it's like you were never gone. So, I mean, the GM can, like, I won't say take a day off, but the GM can kind of kick back and just let it run. A lot of online, especially YouTube discourse, lays out the railroad tracks. There are probably a good number of us old timers who know what I'm talking about. I hear a good amount of talk, especially on YouTube, which usually tells new dungeon masters, especially about creating plot and narrative and story structure in their games. And hey, I'll admit, back 30 years ago, I was guilty of giving some of that advice. I wouldn't now, of course. I'll be brutal with this particular piece of advice. If you want to create a story from start to finish and the players are just expected to go along with every story beat, write a book. I know that might be hard to swallow for some D&D 5e or 5e 2024 dungeon masters, and I'm sorry. But I mean, that's the honest, brutal truth, and you won't hear that a lot on YouTube, especially with the Dungeon Tuber crowd. There is life outside of whatever plot you had envisioned for the game, especially in a long-term campaign. Now, in a one-shot, yeah, you can kind of get away with this, although I still wouldn't necessarily recommend it. The main thing is if you're working with a convention format, you've only got 4 hours to run your game, or you're running an online game where you've only got a couple of hours, then yeah, you can kind of try to steer the narrative a little bit if you wanted to get to a certain villain or a certain encounter. But then again, there's been plenty of convention games where I've just crumpled the module up, threw it over my shoulder, and said, "All right, what do you guys want to do?" Ain't no sense trying to railroad people when their time is short, your time is short, they're paying to be there. Like, okay, what do you want to do? Maybe you can still sandwich in bits of the module here and there. maybe not. But that's really a longer discussion for a different time. There is light at the end of the tunnel, though. You don't have to script every NPC dialogue or figure out exactly where the group is headed next like it was a video game. Take some time during prep to build up some NPCs, even if they're just generic NPCs, to drop into the characters' lives whenever you need them. That way, you're never completely caught off guard without a character for them to interact with. I like to create minor NPCs with 3 notable traits, a description, and maybe a desired goal. No real stats unless I wholeheartedly believe they could potentially be involved in some sort of combat. I'm not a big fan of what are called DM NPCs or GM NPCs that travel around with the party necessarily, or if they do, they're in the background. They're a healer that just happens to ride around in the wagon and rarely goes into combat because he's old and frail and really can't handle being in combat. We actually had that in a game. Wow. Memories. Yay. So anyway, yeah, I mean, I'll put a little bit of gear and spells and stuff on and a little bit of personal history just for making conversation with the PCs, but I rarely see an NPC that takes up a full page ever. Like usually it's less. And this technique can also be applied to locations that the group could potentially visit: inns, taverns, blacksmiths, Boyer Fletcher, arrowsmiths, stable keepers, some random kid that hangs out in the practice area, the stables, whatever. In other words, people that the PCs could potentially encounter just walking down the main street of any given village. I might also cook up something for a few random farmers, food vendors, townsfolk, town elders, or, some kind of significant political figure or royalty if there's any, and maybe like one shadowy individual who may or may not be attached to the Thieves Guild. Oh, and let's not forget some military law enforcement figures in town because, every town has to have a guard or a militia or something to keep the peace. For some reason, that always seems to come up with the PCs. I don't know what it is. Next, not every NPC has to point the group to a specific direction. Maybe the innkeeper really is clueless when it comes to the goings on of the local townsfolk. He just keeps his nose down in his mugs that he's cleaning. He worries about, keeping the pottage hot and adding a little bit of broth to it every once in a while. Perhaps the blacksmith hasn't ever heard of whatever magical MacGuffin the group is chasing after. Maybe the farmer really hasn't seen the giant ant monster that is reportedly terrorizing the other farmers. He just worries about his sheep. Why would he care about the other farmers? He doesn't even really want to associate with them. He's practically a hermit. But yeah, not every character the group meets needs to be a walking lore dump. Use that tool with caution. Don't have every NPC they run into be completely lost as to what's going on, or else the group will never get anywhere and they'll start getting bored. But every once in a while, it's kind of nice to throw that in there. And then again, we can also say, sometimes that linear branch I was talking about earlier, that linear structure I was talking about earlier, starts to branch off, and maybe there's dead ends. Maybe there are some false leads. Maybe there are some encounters or NPCs that aren't even on the storyline. Some of my adventures started looking like a grid eventually with like a bunch of relationship notes and motivations and just random bits of lore that were attached to that specific NPC that had nothing to do with any kind of a narrative or anything. Unless it's a dungeon with hallways that are connected from room to room. And then, of course, you have to have some synergy. The key here is to disconnect as a GM or DM. Don't pretend that you know exactly what the group is going to do next. Yes, they might tell you at the end of the session, we're going to go to blank town and talk to blank character, only to go a completely different route and talk to a completely different character the next game. Surprise! And this happens a lot if your wife sneaks a peek at your notes, too. This is actually why I stopped keeping meticulous notes about plots and storyline. For one, like I said, I'm pretty sure my wife and maybe even one of my players who was my roommate at the time were sneaking looks at my notes. And I've just kind of stuck to the idea that my notes are probably part of public discourse by the time the game starts. And for another, no plan ever survives contact with the PCs or the timetable. And you can carve that into stone around here somewhere. I will stand by that forever. Nothing you plan will ever survive contact with the group, at least not perfectly. It is very rare when a plan goes off exactly as I came up with it. A lot of times I will have the name of the town, a few people who live there, some vague idea of what they might run into. And for everything else, there's random tables if I really get desperate. Otherwise, I try not to plan more than a session or two ahead. Maybe more if we're doing a hex crawl, because like if they can turn and go in any direction and travel up to 6 hexes a day, I might kind of want to curtail that at least a little bit so that I know where they're headed, or at least I know what territory they're heading into. So if there's a jungle coming up or a swamp or if they're heading up onto the Arctic plain eventually, that's good to know. So that you're not totally caught with your pants down. Found that out the hard way recently. Again, subject of another video. But long story for another time on that one. Anything more than a couple sessions ahead, and I feel like I'm wasting paper or pixels, the group usually manages to bypass, blow up, or overcomplicate anything specific I had plotted out, which is why I switched up my paradigm. And yes, I pronounce it paradigm. Anyway, if you remember that commercial, hey, cool. Hopefully you're keeping up on your arthritis prescription like I do. What about my big bad evil genius and his or her plans for world domination, you ask? If the group ignores whatever breadcrumbs and keep offing this guy's minions at every turn, maybe his plan goes ahead as scheduled. If they're going to space it off, maybe the plan just goes through because the group failed to interfere in time. So, for example, we'll use Star Wars because I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I miss Star Wars, at least the D6 Star Wars. Maybe the Death Star comes around the corner, and since nobody managed to pull off the miracle shot down the exhaust port, it fires and blows Yavin straight off the map. Well, now we have to recover what's left of the Rebel Alliance, if there is anything, and regroup and try to find a way to stop this Death Star from blowing up more planets and conquering more systems. There's just times when we didn't get her done in time to stop this guy, and eventually news will get back to the PCs that, hey, Mr. Demonologist managed to summon the big bad from out of the pit, or the cultists managed to open the Eldritch portal and summon in one of the elder gods that everybody had been warned about multiple times. They told you it was coming, and now Cthulhu's here, and there isn't a darn thing you can do about him. Hey, if you've given them as many hints as you can, if you've practically held up a big neon sign that says, hey, there's a guy over here that's got this agenda, and like you've been running into his minions all over the place, those guys with the black cultist robe that has the red symbol on the front of it, looks kind of like a sigil. Yeah, you might want to stop them next time. But most of what I'm referring to in this podcast is the sandbox style of play. There are some suggestions of other things that work. Sometimes it's okay to have a plot in mind, but don't get too attached. Most adventures still boil down to who, what, where, why, possibly when, and how. What matters to me as a GM is just to get that ball rolling. Like I said, if you're practically beating them over the head with hints and they don't go that way, okie dokie. Suddenly, that necromancer up in the north has an entire army at his disposal and it's coming. And if you don't get out of the way of it, it's going to probably run right into you. And then you're either going to be like the rest of the peasants and be subjugated or else. So that's why it's kind of important for the players to pay attention to things sometimes. But you can have the most elaborate sandbox campaign ever laid out on a hex map. Just waiting for the PCs to come spread some love, but it doesn't do a lick of good unless they have some motivation to go explore. You can have the most sinister of big bad evil geniuses waiting for them with some crazy scheme to take over the Tri-Kingdom area, but it does no good if the group never finds out about it? And more importantly, why should they care? Maybe there's a platypus out there that can solve the problem for them. If the session, or maybe the campaign even, starts in media res, the threat is imminent, and the group must react in order to survive. And I will say beware of overusing this tactic because the players will start to expect it, especially at the start of a session where like nothing else has been going on. Once in a while, it's fun to leave the group stranded on a mysterious island in the middle of nowhere with no idea how they got there at the very beginning of the game or the very beginning of the session. And you can kind of warn them about it during session 0 that could happen, because if somebody's not cool with it and they built up this whole elaborate backstory and you just crumple it up and throw it over your shoulder, that's probably not cool either. Yes, PC backstory should have a role to play in their motivation, assuming they gave you anything to work with and it wasn't a 39-page novel of their own. Working some of what they gave you into the sandbox is usually pretty easy, and it'll help later on in answering some of the big 6 questions I asked above, the who, what, when, where, and all that. Other formats that might work. My friend Kelsey Dion, back in 2020, I think, had a newsletter, and there can be a happy medium between the sandboxing and the railroading, which is kind of what I've been talking about. I forget what she called it now, but it's a format that starts out immersing the group in the story and then kind of letting them decide if, where they want to go to run with it or not. Sometimes the group is fickle and they won't. And from what I know of Kelsey's games, they usually do go where she kind of had in mind. When I ran a lot of Cyberpunk, Werewolf, Deadlands, superhero games, I usually didn't have an elaborate plot in mind. And I know that might come as a surprise to some of my group. But the group had like a home base, which in D&D 24, that's a bastion now, I guess, sort of. They automatically get one from what I'm told, which is weird. But the group had a home base and a bunch of familiar NPCs that they saw daily. So, in other words, in Deadlands, they had some townfolk that they knew. And usually one of those townfolk could get them involved in some part of their lives. Like the farmer had a cow that had gone lame because of the zombie virus. They had an inventor friend that was a mad scientist, and this is all Deadlands. In Werewolf, they had the pack that they normally traveled with, and it got to the point where even like one of the main characters had a bunch of neighbors and stuff, and was just kind of a weirdness magnet that brought in all this other strange stuff with the kinfolk and all this other business. And of course, Cyberpunk, everybody's got contacts, everybody's got media figures they recognize and stuff like that. I won't get into all the Cyberpunk stuff right now. Having some familiar NPCs that the group might be somewhat attached to is pretty good motivation. Oh, bank's being robbed? Oh, Rex's girlfriend was going to the bank this morning. Sure hope she's not in the middle of the hostage situation. And of course, we all know that she will be. And it's not really a railroad. It's just that one is hard for our heroes to turn down. And yes, they could let the boring old police handle it, or they could hero up and go do something about it. I used that hero up line once, and nobody caught on to the reference until way later. It was hilarious. But you can build a cork board or a marker board with names and relationships on it. If a business relationship between two NPCs falls apart, the group might be in for some bumpy financial times in a Cyberpunk game. If someone's crush admits to the scream sheets right before a big concert, or the following media scandal might make it hard to get out there and do any real running as a Cyberpunk group, or as a Cyberpunk character rather. I've cooked up many elaborate relationship dynamics in the past. It's fun, but I will warn you that the more NPCs you add, the more moving parts there are to keep track of from one week to the next. And I'll talk about that in another video too. But yeah, just be careful if you have too many moving parts. Eventually one of them will spin around to hit you, because like the players will be like, hey, what about such and such? And you'll just be sitting there going, "Oh, no. Oh, what did I say about him last time? Oh, no." It's important to take notes, guys. I will mention that. It is important to take notes. I've also done multi-branch linear style games where things might go from A to D to C to H and then Z with a lot of branches and dead ends and red herrings. And in a longer campaign, that's fun. Just to watch the players follow all the little leads until some of them don't pan out. Uh, but eventually you want the group to, get to that last part of the line, as it were. And some points of the adventure don't even have a line drawn to them and were planned on the off chance that the group pulled out something I hadn't planned on yet. Sometimes the outside world reacts to what the group is doing. Other times, NPCs have their own agendas to carry out, and the heroes may or may not interfere. Stop the train robbery or figure out why Farmer Barley's cows are suffering from demonic possession. The stranger realization comes when both things are related. More on that some other time. I would suggest taking a look at what novel writers are doing for more inspiration. Now, don't write a novel. Well, I mean, write a novel if you want to write a novel, but not everyone has a game modeled after a well-known actual play series. Not every GM is blessed with a dozen talented and well-paid voice actors in their cast either. Sometimes novel writers will come up with interesting approaches that can be sandwiched into your game formatting. Now, like I said, don't, plan out a whole novel for the PCs to read, because that's just not how that's going to work most of the time, but practically all the time, really. But, sometimes novel writers, and I follow some I won't say book talk, but booktube people more on the writer end of things than the other end of things. And even on like X, Twitter, whatever we're calling it these days, I follow Alyssa Hazel and a couple of other writers that they occasionally will come up with something, for that kind of crosses over to role playing that you can incorporate into your game. It can be done. And I could talk about plotting and character development all day. I used to deal with this kind of thing quite a bit. As I said originally, we teach new GMs and DMs the linear formula because it's the easiest thing to grasp and it doesn't require a ton of player motivation. And sometimes that's fine. People will still roll with that 20 years later. However, some players don't like to be told where to go and what to do. So setting them up for success is simply a matter of giving them NPCs, situations, and maybe some incentive like loot for them to interact with. They'll find the adventure. It's only a matter of when and how. Sometimes you have to just throw that module over your shoulder and ask the group where they want to go. Okay, we're done dealing with the beholder that likes the goldfish. The heck with this noise. Let Waterdeep fall into the sea. We don't care. Or let it fall into the abyss. We don't care. We want to go see what's north. Or we want to go take on the Red Wizards of Thay. Or we want to do something else. Okay, cool. We'll make it work. As always, do what works best for you and your players. It's fun to experiment with different presentation styles and adventure formats until you finally hit that sweet spot, and then just keep going. The group will thank you for keeping things interesting and engaging. Thank you for turning in. Be sure to like the subscribe button and smash that share. And I'll talk to you in the next one.